what matters is how and to what end communists participate in elections. It's not simply to win, it's to expose the contradictions of capitalism and show how limited the so-called democracy really is. And we can use elections as a platform to win over more layers of working class to communism and to give the working class confidence in their ability to run society themselves. Most people do not know what communism is or how it would solve their concerns today. It seems far off and utopian to people who are sympathetic even. So we need to raise demands that address people's immediate concerns, but which at the same time, by attempting to fight for these demands, would basically bring out revolutionary situation because they come into conflict with the foundations of capitalism itself. And these are transitional demands. I think you've heard something about our new mayor here in New York. And Mamdani's election represents a significant shift in the general consciousness of the masses. You know, New York, of all places, he was elected somebody who's not a Zionist, that alone. And he beat the corrupt Eric Adams and Cuomo, whose defeats are definitely worth celebrating. But the ruling class has gone on the offensive against him. The Wall Street Journal saying, want Soviet breadlines, vote for Mamdani, right? Bloomberg funneled millions of dollars into ads against Zoran. Trump has threatened to send the National Guard troops and withhold federal funds from New York with Mamdani as mayor, right? And so Mamdani could try to oppose a budget next summer that funds some of the programs that he campaigned on, free childcare, free buses, cheaper groceries. And if he does, there will be really strong resistance from the capitalists, from other Democrats to such a budget. And they will fight tooth and nail against raising taxes for the rich. Zoran could use that resistance to expose the whole system. All the campaigners that knocked on millions of doors in the lead up to the election could be mobilized into workplaces and neighborhoods. We could tell people that only the collective power of the working class can win free transit and cheaper groceries. And the masses would then learn in the actual struggle for around like a city budget that who the real class enemy is. And it could go much farther than just a fight for a city budget. But really, it's not Zoran himself that Trump, Cuomo, and Bloomberg would see as a threat, but it's the working class people that voted for him who might start thinking they can fight for better standards of living, even without any additional encouragement. While one section of the ruling class outright attacks Mamdani, we see another wing that has been working to envelop him and pluck out all the pesky barbs in his rhetoric. Obama has called Zoran personally twice to offer some friendly advice and to be his sounding board. The New York governor Hochul endorsed him and praised his pragmatism, his willingness to compromise. And so standing up to the pressure of bourgeois electoral politics is not a walk in the park, and it can't be done alone. Winning an election in and of itself is not the end, but it's the beginning, and it's what you can actually accomplish with a position that matters. And so what approach do communists take towards Mamdani? Lenin says it's an obligation for communists to participate in parliament, in elections. And this is sometimes quoted by other left groups as a reason to justify uncritically endorsing any candidate that is running as a Democrat who puts forward any sort of vaguely progressive ideas in their campaign. DSA claims to have gotten many socialists elected in government by supporting such Democrats. Though it varies how often these elected officials publicly use the socialist label. But for communists, class independence is a principle. Whatever we do, it must be with the aim of increasing working class consciousness, confidence, and unity. Supporting the Democratic Party, a bourgeois party, blurs the division between the working class and the capitalist class. Lenin also said there are times to boycott elections altogether. Is this a contradiction? Is this contradiction the result of Lenin having a bad memory? No, because Marxist method is not about quoting the Holy Scripture to prove our preconceived ideas. There's no formula or flowchart telling us whether and when and how to participate in elections and which candidate to support. We must use our own brains and judge from experience the development of class consciousness and the strength of our forces. We have experiences we can draw from, and not just 100 years ago either. In 2016, Bernie Sanders ran a campaign using the slogan, "Revolution against the billionaire class." And this is a real turning point in American politics, because before that, you didn't have people discussing socialism as if it was a mainstream word. Sanders was not a communist. He called himself a democratic socialist. His campaign used slogans that attacked the 1% richest in the country. He was in favor of the bottom 99%. He ran for Democratic ticket, but what was accomplished out of his campaigns? Did he move the Democrats to the left, as some argued his campaign would do? On the contrary, I would say the Democrats have moved him further and further to the right. Did he win more people over to socialism? I think it's definitely a more popular word, but if he had broken from the Democratic Party and called on his supporters to form an initial framework of a socialist party or a workers' party or any other name, maybe we would be able to gauge whether he won more people over to socialism or not. But he didn't, so none of that really materialized into a force. Instead, many of those that campaigned for Bernie Sanders became apathetic, or they voted for Trump later on. And there's also a layer of young people for whom the word socialist now leaves a bad taste in their mouth, the taste of betrayal. They have moved beyond democratic socialism and taken on the label of communist. And so instead of drawing class lines more clearly, Bernie Sanders muddled them, and by talking about the 1% only to fall in line behind Hillary Clinton, he showed his true allegiance was to the Democratic Party leaders rather than to those that voted and campaigned for him twice. The people going to Bernie Sanders rallies were people that were very open to socialist ideas, and we had an obligation to engage with that. So we did not go to Sanders rallies just to tell them, from the sidelines, like, he's gonna betray you, don't listen to him, he's not a real socialist because he's running as a Democrat. No, we talked to them and said, we also see the inequality between the 1% and the 99%. And we explained that these terms refer to the capitalist class and the working class. And we told the truth that the Democrats are a capitalist party. And in order to effectively fight for the 99%, if that is what Sanders really intends to do, he will need to break from the Democrats. And to endorse him would have blurred class lines and confused people into thinking we can work within the Democratic Party to achieve Sanders' program. But we also couldn't just ignore his campaign. We weren't going to be able to win the masses or even thousands of people due to our size in 2016. But we were able to win over some Bernie supporters after they drew the conclusions that Sanders wasn't going to lead them any farther. We were able to win them to consistent revolutionary Marxism, to communism. And in doing so, we trained this layer of our comrades to be able to win people over from reformist positions. And we can do the same with people who voted for Mamdani. We can start by saying we're also happy to see Cuomo lose. We're also very in favor of not just freezing rent, but lowering it. And we're also in favor of cheaper groceries. But we need to also tell these supporters the truth in a way that challenges a Mamdani voter to think bigger beyond just this election. And we can point out that in order to really wage a battle against New York landlords who are not like a wimpy species, you need to mobilize the working class. And you cannot do that from within the Democrats, the party of landlords. So while this isn't winning the masses, it's on the road to get there, in the sense that we now have that experience in training people to explain the ideas at a level where political consciousness is really at.